Chapter 3. In the blistering heat of the late afternoon sun, faint wisps of sulphurous steam rose from tiny fumaroles in the volcano's mouth, coiling like a dancer's veil in that shadowy dark beneath the edge before they vanished into the intense glare above. Atrus stood on the lip of the volcano, staring out across the deep bowl of the caldera, his eyes, his glasses, the largest of the two pairs that he had hung in his grandmother's workroom, pulled down over his face, the thick leather band hugging the back of his shaven head tightly beneath the white cloth hood he now wore. Over his mouth and nose was the cloth mask that Anna had made for him and insisted that he wear, while about his waist was a thick belt studded with tools, a perfect copy of the one his grandmother wore about her own. 14 now, Atrus had grown fast this past year. He was almost a man's height, but he had yet begun to fill out. His face, too, had changed, taking on the harder, more angular shape of manhood, both nose and chin having lost the softness they'd had in childhood. He was not a weak boy, not by any means, yet, watching him from the top of the cleft wall, Anna noted how thin he was. When the desert winds blew, she was afraid they would carry him away. There seemed so little of him. For the past few weeks he had been setting up his experiment, and now he was ready to begin. Turning, Anna climbed down out of the burning light into the deep, much cooler shadow just below the lip. Here on a narrow ledge he had rigged up most of his equipment. Straight ahead the volcano wall fell away steeply, while to his right, just beyond a curiously rounded rock that looked as though it had been formed from melting mud, was a narrow vent. Above it he had placed a domed cap made of beaten metal. It was crudely manufactured, but effective, and he had staked it to the surrounding rock with 4 thick pins. On top of this dome was fixed a small metal cylinder. Atrus reached up, his gloved hands gently turning the tiny knobs on either side of his glasses, adjusting the opacity of the lenses so that he could see better. Then, brushing a fine layer of dust from the top of the metal cap, he leaned forward and studied the finger-length silver valve, checking its welding for the dozenth time before glancing at the 2 crudely calibrated gauges that were set into the dome's face to either side of the valve. Just above each of the dials was a thumb-sized metal stud, a small circular hole bored through the top of each. Atrus straightened, letting out a long breath. He had one chance at this, and so it had to be right. If it went wrong, if it didn't work, then it would be a year or more before they could get all the parts they needed away from the traders. He turned, looking up to where 2 big coiled wires he had made himself under Anna's supervision, dangled over the edge of the crater. Just above them, jutting out over the drop, was a long arm of jet-black stone. 2 small wheels had been pinned into its face at the far end of where it overhung the volcano. A hand-woven rope ran between the wheels, forming a winch. Like the cap, it seemed crude, yet it would serve its purpose perfectly. To test it, Anna had spent several afternoons lowering rocks into the maw, then raising them again, rocks many times the weight of the load it would have to carry now. On the other side of the crater's lip, just next to where the rock arm was weighed down by a pile of heavy stones, sheltered by a makeshift tent, was his pride and joy. The beginning and end of all this patient endeavor. His battery. Reaching up, he grasped one of the wires, pulling it toward him, drawing out enough of its length so that it was stretched to the metal cap. Attaching it to one of the studs, he then repeated the process. Adjusting his glasses, he clambered back up the wall and over the lip, out into the burning sunlight. For a moment, he stood there, getting his breath. Each time he emerged from the shadow, it was like stepping into a furnace. Not did it matter how often he did it. Every time, the change from the cool of the shade to the sudden stifling heat of the open was like a physical blow. Ducking underneath the thick cloth screen of the tent, Atrus smiled. This time he had tried hard to look at all the angles, to make sure he took all aspects of the whole into account of his calculations. The battery rested in the corner of the tent, against a ledge of rock. Looking at the massive thing, Atrus felt it justifiable pride. He had cut out the block of stone himself, and using Anna's finest cutting tools, he'd hollowed it, following the design of the ancient Denis book. Making the plates for the battery was comparably easy. Chemicals lay in abundance in the dry soil surrounding the volcano, and he had been fortunate to find a large deposit of galena, an ore containing the mixture of sulfur and lead not far from the cleft. As for the sulfuric acid he had needed, the one substance that was in abundance on the volcano was sulfur. Indeed, when he was finally came to make it, the only thing that had limited the size of the battery was its weight. Adjusting the lenses once again, Atrus knelt and studied it proudly. He spent many nights buffing and polishing the stone, and then on a whim he had carved 3 ancient Dini words into its side. The complex characters, tiny elaborate works of art in themselves. Light, power, force. It looked like a tiny stone house. The metallic glint of its terminals gave it a strange exotic look. Beside it, altogether different, lay a second, much smaller box, the explosive device. This one was made of an unglazed red clay, cast in his grandmother's kiln. Undecorated, the single rounded aperture on its top face was plugged with a hard seal of wax, from the center of which jutted a length of thick twine which he had treated with a solution of various highly reactive chemicals. On its front face was a thick clay handle. Carefully, he picked it up, and wrapping it in his cloak, carried it outside. Easing his way over the lip once more, he steadied himself, one hand against the rough, crumbling wall as he edged down onto the ledge. Setting the box down, he turned, and standing on tiptoe, reached up and caught hold of the thick metal hook on the end of the rope. Gently tugging at it, hearing the brake mechanism click and then click again on the far side of the rim. That, too, was his own invention. On some of the earliest trials of the winch, he had found that the rock dragged the rope down much too quickly, and when he had tried to slow it, the rope had burned his palms. After much experimentation, he had devised a way of stopping the supply wheel after each rotation, so that the winch could only be operated by a series of gentle tugs. Bending down, he picked the box up again and slipped the curved tip of the hook through the handle. Then turning back and holding on the rope out away from him, slowly lowered it over the drop. As the rope went taut, he moved back. And there was only one more thing to do now. Reaching into the inner pocket of his cloak, he removed the ancient Dini tinderbox. Leaning over, one hand supporting him against the rock arm, he held the flame beneath this end of the twine fuse on the dangling box. Then, when it had caught, released the catch and stepped back. For a moment, he thought it had gone out. Then with a fizz, it began to burn fiercely. Atrus turned and, half running up the slope, scrambled out over the rim, making for the winch. This was the most crucial part. If the fuse burned too quickly, or if for some reason the winch jammed, things would go wrong. Kneeling beside the brake wheel, he slowly began to turn it, listening to it click and click and click, and all the while tensed against a sudden detonation, all while counting in his head. When he had counted 20, he threw himself down, stretched out flat behind a pile of stones, his hands over his ears. 24, 25, 26. The explosion rocked the side of the volcano. It had been 4 seconds early. Even so, that didn't matter. The box would have been in the correct place, opposite the fault. Atrus laughed, then dusting himself off, stood. As the echoes died, he could hear through the ringing in his ears the sound he had hoped to hear, the strong hiss of steam forcing its way through the cap, and an accompanying high-pitched mechanical whine. Still laughing, he climbed up onto the lip and looked down. The winch arm had gone, as had a large chunk of the ledge. But the vent, protected by the huge rock, was fine. Steam hissed from the cap in a steady, forceful stream. Turning, he looked down at Anna where she stood on the cleft wall. He raised his arms and waved to her eagerly, grinning with triumph. "It works!" he yelled, pulling the mask down from his nose and mouth. "It works!" From below, Anna waved back to him, and then cupping her hands before her mouth, she shouted something, but it was difficult to make out what she was saying. His ears were ringing so much. Besides the furious hissing of the steam, that high-pitched whine seemed to grow by the moment. "Go back?" she'd said, or something like that. Grinning, he nodded, and then waving to her again, turned back to watch the hissing cap. "It worked," he said, quietly, noting how the cap was trembling now, rattling against the 4 restraining pins. It really worked. Climbing down, he went across and, taking care not to get too close, edged around until he could see the gauges. Yes! A thrill of excitement went through him, seeing how both arrows were deep in the red. It was passing a charge. He stood back, grinning, then felt himself grow cold. Even as he watched, one of the metal pins began to move, easing itself slowly from its berth within the rock, as though some invisible but mighty hand were pulling it from the stone. Slowly he began to edge away. As he did, the noise from the cap changed, rising a full octave as if the same invisible hand had pressed down on the key of an organ. Atrus turned and, scrambling from the slope and over the rim, began to run, ignoring the impact of the heat, fighting it, but it was like running through some thick, gluttonous substance. He had gone barely 10 paces when he tumbled forward, coming up fiercely, facing the way he'd come, and as he did, the whole of the rim behind him seemed to lift into the air. Coming to, Atrus looked up, surprised by the sight that met his eyes. On every side, the great walls of the volcano stretched up, forming a jagged circle where they met the startling blueness of the sky. He was in the crater. The rim must have given way. Slowly, he got to his feet. Steam billowed across the rock-cluttered floor of the volcano, concealing its far edges. From time to time, a fissure would form from the clouds, the crystalline shape strangely beautiful. He saw the battery at once. Going over to it, he crouched, then shook his head, amazed by its condition. It was virtually untouched. The polished stone exterior had a few buffs and scratches, but it was still in one piece. Moreover, the dial on the top showed that it was fully charged. Atrus laughed, delighted. Reaching out, he smoothed its upper surface almost lovingly. At least he knew now that the principle was sound. If only he could find the right vent. If only he could get the pressure right. Then it would work. They would have an unlimited supply of electricity. Their lives would be transformed. The cleft would shine like a cat's eye in the desert night. Smiling, Atrus raised his head, looking directly ahead of him. For a moment, a cloud of steam obscured his view. Then as it cleared, he found himself staring into blackness. It was a cave, or a tunnel of some kind. He stood, then took a step toward it, and strange, it was almost as though it had been carved from the surrounding rock. The steam swirled back, concealing it. Atrus! He turned, looking up at Anna high above him, silhouetted against the crater's lip. Come up! Come up here now! Atrus frowned. But my battery! Now! Walking back, she was unnaturally silent. And then suddenly she stopped and turned to face him. Atrus, what did you see? I saw... He hesitated, surprised by her question. Atrus, answer me. What did you see? My battery. My battery was charged. She let out a breath. And was that all? There was steam? Lots of steam? He frowned, then... My battery. I've got to get my battery. He made to turn back, but she placed a hand gently on his arm. Forget the battery. It's too dangerous. Now, come. Let's clean you up.